December 23rd, 1971. Hitsville, USA. The annual Motown Christmas party was in full swing, but in the second-floor corridor, time had stopped. Two figures stood frozen in the dim hallway light, neither speaking, neither moving. 3 years of stolen moments, secret phone calls, and hidden glances had led to this. Diana Ross, wearing a white dress that caught the light from the studio windows, her engagement ring catching the same glow. And Marvin Gaye, leaning against the wall, his usual confidence replaced by something hollow. They had both known this moment would come, but knowing and experiencing are different kinds of pain. The corridor was the same one where they had shared their first real conversation 3 years earlier, after a recording session that had run past midnight. Diana had been crying about something Berry had said to her about the Supremes, about how replaceable they all were. Marvin had found her sitting on the floor by the water fountain, mascara streaked down her cheeks, looking nothing like the poised woman who graced magazine covers. "You know what the worst part is?" she had said without looking up, assuming he was just another late-night session musician walking by. "He's right. We are replaceable. All of us." Marvin had stopped walking. Something in her voice, raw and defeated, had made him pause. "No," he had said quietly. "You're not." That was how it started, not with romance or seduction, but with recognition. Two people who understood what it meant to be commodities in Berry Gordy's empire, valuable only as long as they produced hits, smiled when they were supposed to smile, and never questioned the machine that fed on their talent. Now, 3 years later, standing in that same corridor, Diana looked up at him with eyes that held the weight of everything they had never quite said to each other. "Marvin." Diana's voice was barely a whisper, the kind of sound that carries more weight than screaming. He didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. For 3 years, he had convinced himself that what they shared meant something, that the late-night recording sessions where they lingered longer than necessary meant something, that the way she looked at him during those duets, when the rest of the world disappeared, meant something, that the stolen hours when they would drive to the lake outside Detroit and just talk, really talk, about their dreams and fears and the suffocating weight of being Motown royalty, meant something. But Diana Ross was now engaged to Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown, the man who controlled everything, including, apparently, the woman Marvin had foolishly believed might choose him. The engagement had been announced 3 days ago at a press conference that looked more like a corporate merger than a declaration of love. Diana standing beside Berry, her smile perfect and practiced, her answers to reporters' questions rehearsed and empty. Marvin had watched it on television from his studio, gripping the remote so hard his knuckles went white. "Congratulations!" The word left Marvin's mouth like broken glass. "Barry's a lucky man." Diana's eyes searched his face, looking for something. Forgiveness, understanding, permission to explain. But Marvin's expression had already closed off, the way a house shuts down room by room until only darkness remains. "You don't understand," she started, taking a half-step toward him. Her voice was strained, and Marvin could see the effort it took for her to keep her composure. "This isn't about love, Marvin. This is about survival." Marvin finished her sentence, pushing off from the wall. "I understand perfectly. I understand better than you think." The corridor suddenly felt impossibly narrow. 3 years ago, when Diana was still with the Supremes and Marvin was still married to Anna Gordy, they had found themselves working late one night on what would become a forgotten B-side. Everyone else had gone home. Just Diana and Marvin, sharing headphones in the mixing booth, their shoulders touching as they listened to playback. That night, something had shifted. Diana had mentioned how tired she was of being perfect, of never being allowed to just exist without being judged. Marvin had talked about the loneliness that came with success, about how even surrounded by people, he felt fundamentally alone. They had talked until the sun came up, and when the janitors arrived to clean the building, Diana and Marvin were still sitting in the booth. Coffee cups empty, voices hoarse from hours of conversation. That was the beginning of something that had no name, because it couldn't have a name. Marvin was married to Berry's sister. Diana was Motown's golden girl. They were both trapped in the machine that Berry had built, and for a brief moment, they had found each other in that trap. What followed were months of carefully orchestrated encounters, late-night phone calls when Anna was asleep, Conversations that lasted until sunrise about everything except the thing they both felt. Marvin would call Diana's apartment at 2 a.m., and they would talk about music, about dreams, about the suffocation that came with success. Diana would tell him about the pressure of being perfect, of being America's sweetheart when she felt like a stranger to herself. Marvin would tell her about the loneliness that came with fame, about feeling like a performer even in his own home. There had been moments when they almost crossed the line, a recording session for a duet that never made it to release, where they stood so close in the vocal booth that Marvin could count Diana's eyelashes. A company party where they danced one slow song, and Diana's head rested against his shoulder just a moment longer than was appropriate. A drive to the lake where they sat in Marvin's car as rain pounded the windshield, and Diana reached across the space between them to touch his hand, her fingers intertwining with his for just a heartbeat before she pulled away. They never called it love. Love was too dangerous, too complicated. But when Diana laughed at something he said, really laughed, not the practiced laugh she gave interviewers, Marvin felt something he had forgotten existed. When Marvin sang to her, just to her, during those late studio sessions, Diana felt understood in a way that had nothing to do with charts or sales figures. Now standing in this hallway with what felt like miles between them, that understanding felt like something from another lifetime. Berry can give you everything, Marvin said, his voice steady but distant. Security, power, the career you've always wanted. I couldn't even give you honesty. Diana's composure cracked slightly. You gave me yourself. That was enough. No, it wasn't. Marvin's words came out harder than he intended. If it was enough, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You'd be downstairs telling people about our engagement, not his. The truth hung between them like a weight. Diana was 27 years old and at the peak of her career. The Supremes were the most successful girl group in history, and her solo career was already being planned by Berry himself. Marvin was 32 and married to a woman he had grown to resent, trapped in a relationship that had become more business arrangement than marriage. They were both imprisoned by their choices, by their ambitions, by the very success they had worked so hard to achieve. You know why I can't, Diana said, and for the first time her voice shook slightly. You know what this would cost both of us. Marvin nodded slowly. He did know. A public relationship between them would destroy Diana's carefully crafted image and end Marvin's marriage in the most expensive way possible. Berry Gordy would make sure neither of them worked again, and Anna Gordy Gaye would take everything Marvin had earned, including his children. The scandal would kill both their careers and leave them with nothing but each other, which in the cold light of reality might not be enough to survive on. But knowing the practical reasons didn't make the emotional reality any easier to bear. So we pretend, Marvin said, leaning back against the wall. We go downstairs, we congratulate the happy couple, we sing Christmas songs, and we pretend the last 3 years didn't happen. Marvin, please don't make this harder than it already is. Harder? Marvin's laugh was bitter, echoing off the corridor walls. Diana, I've spent 3 years falling in love with someone who was never really mine. I don't think it gets much harder than that. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Neither of them had ever said love before. It had always been too final, too honest, too dangerous. But now that the word was out there, it changed everything and nothing. Diana stepped closer, close enough that Marvin could smell her perfume, the same scent that had haunted his dreams for months. You think this is easy for me? You think I don't feel anything? I think you feel everything, Marvin said quietly, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. I just think you feel other things more. The sound of laughter drifted up from downstairs, where the party continued without them. Berry Gordy's voice could be heard telling a story, probably about the early days of Motown, probably embellished for effect. Diana's engagement would be announced officially tomorrow, but tonight everyone was already treating it like old news. People were toasting the future Mr. and Mrs. Gordy, making jokes about keeping it in the Motown family, speculating about what kind of wedding they would have. I should go back, Diana said, but she didn't move. Yeah, Marvin agreed. You should. They stood there for another moment, both aware that this was ending something that had never quite begun. Tomorrow, Diana would be photographed with Berry at the engagement announcement. Next week, the trades would run the story with headlines about Motown's power couple, Next month, they would start planning the wedding that would cement Berry's control over his empire and Diana's place in it. And Marvin would go home to Anna and pretend that his heart hadn't just been systematically dismantled in a Motown corridor. "For what it's worth," Diana said, her hand reaching out to touch the wall beside Marvin's shoulder, not quite touching him, but close enough to feel his warmth. "These were the best 3 years of my life." Marvin looked at her for a long moment, memorizing her face. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her mouth set in that determined line he knew so well. Diana Ross, who had conquered America with the Supremes, who had made teenage girls across the country want to be her and teenage boys fall in love with her, looked smaller somehow. Human, breakable. "Mine too," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite hide. Then Diana turned and walked back toward the stairs, her heels clicking against the wooden floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Marvin watched her go, memorizing everything. The way she moved, the way her dress caught the light from the studio windows, the way her shoulders were held just a little too straight, the way her hand briefly touched the banister before she started down the stairs. At the top of the stairs, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. For a moment, Marvin thought she might say something else, might change her mind, might choose him after all. For just a heartbeat, it felt like she might walk back to him, might choose love over security, might choose truth over survival. Instead, she smiled. Not the Diana Ross smile that sold millions of records and graced 1,000 magazine covers, but something smaller, sadder, more real. It was the same smile she had given him that first night when they talked until sunrise, the smile that was just for him. Then she was gone, back to the party, back to Berry, back to the life she had chosen. The sound of her heels on the stairs faded, replaced by the distant sounds of the Christmas party below. Marvin remained in the corridor for several more minutes, listening to the sounds of celebration that seemed to come from another world. Someone had started playing piano, and voices joined in singing Silent Night. Diana's voice was unmistakable, soaring above the others, perfect and controlled, and giving nothing away. She could have been singing about anything, to anyone. There was no trace of the woman who had just stood in this corridor with tears in her eyes. When Marvin finally went home that night, Anna was already asleep in their bed, her face turned away from the door. He sat in his study until dawn, not writing music, not listening to records, just sitting in the darkness. The house felt different somehow, smaller and colder, as if something essential had been removed from it. The next morning, he would wake up and everything would be different. He would still be Marvin Gaye, and Diana would still be Diana Ross, but they would never again be whatever they had been to each other. 3 months later, Diana married Berry Gordy in a ceremony that made the cover of Jet magazine and was featured in newspapers across the country. The wedding was everything one would expect from Motown royalty, lavish, well-orchestrated, and perfect for publicity. Marvin sent a wedding gift, an expensive crystal vase with no note attached. Diana never acknowledged receiving it, but years later, Marvin would learn from a mutual friend that she kept it on her bedroom dresser for the rest of her marriage, even after she and Berry divorced. They would see each other at Motown events over the years, always polite, always professional, always careful not to stand too close or talk too long. There would be Grammy parties and record release celebrations, anniversary dinners and charity events, where they would exchange pleasantries about their work, their families, their continued success. And if sometimes Diana's laugh seemed forced when Berry told his stories, or if sometimes Marvin's smile seemed hollow when he congratulated them on their anniversaries, well, that was just the price of success in a business where everything was performance, even heartbreak. Years later, when Marvin would be asked about his greatest regret, he would always give the same answer: not being brave enough. People assumed he was talking about his music, but those who knew him understood that he was talking about that corridor, about a woman he let walk away. Diana would never speak publicly about Marvin beyond professional courtesy, but friends noticed that whenever his songs came on the radio, her expression would change. She would become very still, as if listening for something only she could hear. The marriage to Berry lasted 13 years, but people close to the family knew that Berry and Diana slept in separate bedrooms for the last 7 years. They knew that Diana had a habit of taking long drives alone, always to the lake outside Detroit where she and Marvin used to go. After the divorce in 1977, Diana moved to New York and threw herself into work with an intensity that worried her friends. When people asked why she worked so hard, Diana would smile that perfect smile and say she loved what she did. But late at night, when the cameras were gone, Diana would sit in her Manhattan apartment and wonder what would have happened if she had been brave enough to choose differently. If she had walked back down that corridor to Marvin instead of down the stairs to Berry. Marvin's music became more political, more personal, more raw after that night. Albums like What's Going On contained depths of emotion that critics praised but couldn't fully understand. They heard the pain in his voice, but they didn't know its source. In 1977, when reporters asked if he planned to remarry, Marvin smiled that enigmatic smile and said he didn't believe in marriage anymore. What he didn't say was that he had already given his heart away years ago to someone who had chosen security over love. The corridor on the second floor of Hitsville, USA, was eventually converted into office space. But for years afterward, people would comment that it felt different from the rest of the building. Colder somehow. Lonelier. Berry Gordy himself, when he sold the building in 1972, made a point of walking through every room one last time. When he reached the second floor corridor, he paused. Something about the space felt familiar, as if he had interrupted an important conversation. In the decades that followed, the story of Marvin and Diana became one of music history's great what-ifs. But those who knew them understood that the real tragedy wasn't about missed musical collaboration. It was about two people who had found something genuine in a world of manufactured emotion, and then lost it to the very success they had worked so hard to achieve. As if some conversations leave permanent shadows, and some goodbyes never quite end.